If you're in the market for an offset smoker, this is one worth looking at because it's not only incredibly inexpensive, it may also save you so much money over time that it actually pays for itself. This is my review of the Old Country Pitts G2 offset smoker, so let's get smoking. Old Country Pitts sent me their G2 offset smoker earlier this year and asked me to review it. The concept they pitched to me is that it's just as heavy duty as the $6,000 plus smokers you'd get from a custom pit builder, but it also has an insulated firebox and it's a fraction of the price. That really piqued my interest because I've never used a backyard smoker that has an insulated firebox before, so I said, yes, I'll do an unsponsored video for free, just send me the pit. And after 6 months of cooking on it, a lot of YouTube notifications popped up for me about other reviews of this smoker. I saw thumbnails from Hey Grill Hey, Smokin' Dad BBQ, and Mad Scientist BBQ, but believe it or not, I didn't actually watch those videos because I wanted this review to be completely unbiased. So this is my own independent, unbiased take of this smoker based on my experience. First, let's talk about the good points, starting with price, and I'll tell you up front, I think this is an extremely low price for a 1/4-inch steel insulated firebox offset smoker. The G2 retails at Academy for $1,900, and at first glance, that doesn't look like an amazing deal when you compare it to other Old Country Pitts products. The Picos retails at $500, and it has the same main chamber cooking grate surface as the G2, but no insulated firebox, and it's only 14 gauge steel, pretty thin. In general, people tend to prefer thicker gauge steel because it retains heat better and it makes fire management easier. It allows you to maintain steadier temperatures. So a $1,400 price difference for thicker steel and an insulated firebox with the G2. For $1,400, that insulated firebox better be worth it, right? Moving on to the Brazos, it retails at $1,200 and it has 1/4-inch steel, so thicker than the Picos, but the same cooking grate surface and no insulated firebox. So for an extra $700, you get an insulated firebox with the G2. So again, that insulated firebox better be worth it because otherwise, why wouldn't you just get a Brazos? Moving on to the Oklahoma Joe's Longhorn offset smoker, which retails at a very low price of $700. It has much thinner steel than the G2 and no insulated firebox, but it does have more cooking surface with a 19-inch by 40-inch grate, and it's $1,200 less than the G2. Now, moving on to custom pit builders, the Lone Star Grill's Texas edition is $3,200 plus around $450 in shipping if you ship it within Texas, so $3,650. Substantially more cooking surface than the G2 with a 24 by 40-inch main chamber and the same steel thickness as the G2, but it's $1,300 more and it doesn't have the insulated firebox. So the question here when comparing them is, are you willing to pay more for a little bit more cooking surface and no insulated firebox? The Workhouse Pitts 1957 is $2,700 with around $700 in shipping if you shipped it to Texas. So let's say around $3,400. It has 3/8-inch steel, which is thicker than the G2, and it also has more main chamber cooking area, but no insulated firebox. So again, are you willing to spend that extra money for a little bit of extra cooking surface and no insulated firebox? Then there's the TMG Pitts Volunteer at $4,400 plus shipping, the Mill Scale 94 at $6,800 plus shipping, the Goldie's Offset at $4,200 plus shipping. Much more expensive pits, and you don't get an insulated firebox, but you do get more cooking surface. And finally, the Franklin Offset Smoker, which has a semi-insulated firebox and more cooking surface than the G2. So it's a little bit more similar to the G2 because it has at least a semi-insulated firebox, but it's $3,300 more expensive and it has a 3 to 4 month lead time to get one. So once again, the Old Country Pitts G2 is looking pretty good in comparison to these top tier smokers at a price point of $1,900. That is very low in comparison. But in order for the G2 to be a good deal for me, it has to accomplish two things. First, the insulated firebox has to be worth it. Otherwise, why wouldn't I just use my Oklahoma Joe's Longhorn, which is much less expensive at $700, and it has more cooking surface than the G2. Let's talk about point number one first. Is the insulated firebox worth the extra money? I did several tests and I found the G2 uses a whopping 100% less fuel than my Longhorn offset smoker to maintain the same cook chamber temperatures. In other words, if you're using the G2 compared to a regular uninsulated firebox, you're going to be using 2 times less fuel. Now, this may matter to you or it might not matter to you depending on where you live in the world. I personally live in Canada and it's extremely hard to find hardwood here, and when you do find a good source of hardwood, it is very expensive. It's about $1,000 for a cord of yellow birch, which is the cheapest hardwood fuel that I can source locally here in Alberta, Canada. And I use about 2 cords of wood a year because I'm a full-time barbecue YouTuber. So if I were to use the Old Country Pit's G2 offset smoker every single day, I would save about $1,000 every year on fuel costs. So it would pay for itself within 2 years. And after that 2 years, it would basically make me $1,000 a year in savings. I would have an extra $1,000 in net profit in my pocket every single year because the insulated firebox is so efficient and it saves me money on fuel. Not only that, the insulated firebox retains heat so well that I'm adding wood every 40 to 60 minutes rather than every 20 minutes on my other offsets. So that saves me time, and as a result, it makes fire management a little bit easier. It's also very cold where I live. It's not unusual for temperatures to drop to -40 degrees with wind chill, and I have to smoke all year round because, again, full-time barbecue YouTuber. But with the G2, I had the opportunity to use it during a Canadian winter, and it was absolutely great because I didn't have to go out every 15 to 20 minutes to add more fuel to my firebox. You have to add way more fuel in the winter, almost double the amount. But with the G2, I had to go out every 40 minutes, so it saved me a lot of time and inconvenience and dressing up and going out in the cold. So this thing is great if you're smoking in a cold environment. And because of the cost savings, the easier fire management, and the better winter performance, yes, the insulated firebox is worth it to me 100%. Second question, is the cooking surface sufficient for me? That's a tougher question. I think for a lot of people, it will probably be sufficient. It cooks one brisket really well if you have it right in the middle of the smoker to the left-hand side, right next to the collector, away from the firebox. You can't really use the third of the smoker that is close to the firebox because there's a really big hot spot there. So you don't really want to put your briskets end to end because the one at the front near the firebox is going to get pretty crispy. And if you put them side by side and you want to do 2 briskets, I found they're really tight together and there's not a lot of room for extra airflow around them. So in my particular situation where I do a lot of comparison cooks with briskets and I need to smoke 2 briskets at the same time, I prefer to actually use my Oklahoma Joe's Longhorn because it has much more cooking surface. And even though it doesn't have the insulated firebox and the fire management is a little bit more annoying, I'm still used to that smoker and it has more cooking surface, and I just find it easier to cook multiple briskets in it. But if I was a regular guy or girl like you who's just doing a backyard brisket and you're doing just 1 brisket to eat that weekend, then yes, 100% I would use the G2. So that's a long discussion of whether the G2 is a good deal for the price, but the short answer is yes, 100%. It's a similar steel thickness to really expensive custom built smokers, and it has an insulated firebox, which will eventually mean that it'll pay for itself in fuel savings, and it'll eventually start making you money because it'll pay for itself and then continue to save you money throughout the years. Now, let's talk about some other good points. First, the airflow and heat is very consistent over what I call the sweet spot in the cook chamber right next to the collector. I get really even cooking with my briskets and the fat cap renders really nicely. Second, it also comes with a baffle and tuning plate, so you can use the baffle to direct air either straight up into the firebox for maximum fat cap rendering on a brisket, or you could put it down and place the tuning plate next to it if you're cooking a bunch of meat and you want to completely fill the smoker, including the upper grate and right next to the firebox, and you're cooking a ton of meat. That baffle plate will help you to minimize the hot spot right next to the firebox. And third, if you have kids or pets, an insulated firebox is great because you can put your hand right on it and you're not going to burn yourself. It's actually almost cool to the touch when you touch it if you're running at a low temperature. And even at a high temperature, you can leave your hand on for several seconds and it's not going to burn you. It is very, very well insulated. Now, moving on to some negative points, or I guess points for improvement. First, the insulated firebox is extremely efficient and you only need a really small fire to maintain a cook chamber temperature below 300 degrees. For the most part, that means having the inlet damper almost completely closed at all times and just kind of tapping it open and closed slightly every so often to maintain your target temperatures. If you build your fire too large or you let too much air into the firebox, you're gonna have some issues because this thing turns into an incinerator. You'll actually hear the air whooshing through the firebox and the cook chamber, and the temperatures can skyrocket north of 500 degrees. I actually got a temperature spike up to 600 degrees once. So with great power comes great responsibility, and this particular cooker has a very large engine for the size of its cook chamber, if you will. So you'll have to constantly be playing with the inlet damper and making sure it's shut a lot so you're not letting a lot of air in. Otherwise, you're gonna get temperature spikes and you could potentially burn your meat very very quickly. So in a way, the G2 is easier for fire management because you're adding fuel less frequently, but it's also harder because you're fiddling around with that inlet damper a lot more because you don't want to let a lot of air in and you need to open and close it quite frequently in order to maintain really steady temperatures. But that being said, if you find the Goldilocks zone with the right amount of airflow and you set the damper correctly, then you're going to get steady temperatures for hours, and it's just amazing. Second negative point, the cooking surface is small compared to other offsets, and I would only really cook one brisket at a time. And as I said before, about a third of the smoker is unusable right next to the firebox because it has a really hot spot. Third, the G2 rusts quite easily compared to other offset smokers that I've used. You can see after 6 months of use, admittedly uncovered, but it was under a gazebo with a steel roof, there is some rust developing and there's even some paint flaking on the bottom where the moisture collected. So I'd recommend buying a cover for this smoker and keeping it well oiled, but to be honest, with the steel thickness of this smoker, you can afford to get a little bit of rust. It's gonna be fine. And finally, this is a bit more on the theoretical side, but technically you might get a little bit less smoke flavor because you're just physically burning less wood and you're also burning it more efficiently. So higher combustion temperatures produce less smoke and less flavor compounds, if you will. So you might get less smoke flavor, but personally, I haven't really noticed a difference with the G2. So in conclusion, would I recommend the Old Country Pit's G2 offset smoker? It depends on your personal preferences. If you're looking to save a lot of money on fuel and decrease the amount of time spent between adding fuel, and you're okay with the limited sweet spot cooking space compared to other offsets, and you can only really cook one brisket at a time comfortably on this smoker, then I would say yes, 100% I would recommend it. And also, if you're looking for a big boy smoker that is a 1/4-inch steel and looks and feels like one of those expensive smokers that you could get from a custom pit builder, then yes, I would recommend the G2. It is priced very low. In fact, just buying the G2 for $1,900 is less expensive than if you went out and bought all of the metal of the same thickness and sizes and tried to make your own smoker. Just buying this thing would be less expensive, which is crazy to me that Old Country Pits can offer something like this for $1,900. And because of that low price, I'm willing to overlook a lot of the negative points and just call this smoker what it is, which is a scream of a deal. I'll see you guys in the next video, and until next time, happy smoking.